What happens when the biggest video game company in the world has their most popular console stolen by their biggest competitor? All-out war. In the courts. Hello and welcome to Video Game Retrospective. Today we're going to be looking at that time that Coleco straight up ripped off Atari and got sued for it. Let's get started. There's no shortage of rabbit holes you can find yourself falling into when exploring the early days of video games, especially when looking at the Atari 2600. Today we're going to look at that time Atari's most successful console, the Atari VCS, was ripped off by their biggest competitor and the legal struggle that followed. We've already covered both the 2600 and the Colecovision before in their own videos, so make sure to check those out. Today we cover the time those systems collided. This video will be split into 3 distinct sections. We will discuss Coleco's dastardly plan to copy the Atari VCS. Then we'll talk all about the legal fallout that caused, and then we'll talk about the awesome system created out of compromise between two video game giants. First, the expansion module 01. This is the expansion module 01, an expansion released alongside the Colecovision that let Coleco fans play Atari VCS games on their Colecovision. It was a really big deal. This little device would terrify and infuriate Atari so much that they would create what is now one of the most important tech lawsuits of all time. Let's discuss how this little beast came to be. As engineers at Coleco were wrapping up development of the world's first super console, the Colecovision, they worried that despite the console being far more powerful than the leading Atari platform, that convincing the public to dump their Ataris with a collection of games built up over the past 4 years would be a hard sell. The solution they came up with for this problem was ingenious. Using the expansion module interface, users would be able to play Atari games on their new console with an expansion module. This would be one of the Colecovision's biggest selling points in its early days, and would steal plenty of sales from Atari. For a modern perspective, that's like if Sony released a dongle for the PlayStation 5 that lets it play Nintendo Switch cartridges without any involvement from Nintendo. That would be absurd. The Colecovision was not at all compatible with the 2600, so the expansion module is essentially a full 2600 that just uses the Colecovision for power and sending a video signal. All the actual work to play games was done by the expansion module itself. Sourcing parts for the expansion module was actually really easy. The majority of parts for the 2600 were easy to source off-the-shelf components. The expansion module used the exact same MOS 6507 CPU as the 2600 and a 6532 Riot chip providing memory and I/O. Both were standard chips that several companies could supply in the 1980s. The only chip that was a problem was the TIA. The TIA was a simplistic audio-video chip that was the soul of the 2600, created by J. Miner. The expansion module would need that chip, or a perfect copy, to function properly. The issue was that the TIA was Atari's property. It was not a chip that could be bought off the shelf like the rest, and using it would certainly be legally dubious. Coleco sourced a clone of the TIA from another company, VTI. VTI's clone was more of an outright copy. The design moved some parts around in an attempt to look like a legally distinct chip, but functionally, it was the same thing. We bought our expansion module on eBay a few days after we picked up our Colecovision. They remain pretty cheap to this day, especially if you buy one loose. You can see from our unit the aesthetics of the expansion module are pretty weird. Parts of it do match the design language of the Colecovision, like its overall color scheme, but it's also clearly modeled after the Atari 2600. It creates quite the weird looking device. You can see it's a very simple device with 2 controller ports on the front and the cartridge port and option switches on the top. It's worth noting that cartridges are inserted the same way as the VCS, with the labels going backwards. I don't know, if I were Coleco, I would have reversed the cartridge slot, but I'm probably the only person really bugged by that layout. Looking back with hindsight, it is pretty obvious that by modern standards, what Coleco pulled would not fly. But in their defense, this was in the very early days for computers and game consoles. Nobody was really sure what was or what was not protected under the law when it comes to console design. Many of the key legal battles that would decide the rules, like Compaq versus IBM and Tengen versus Nintendo, were still a ways out. One thing's for sure though, Atari was mad. Mad enough to sue. Which is what they did. Atari sued Coleco in the Northern Illinois District of the U.S. District Court, Eastern Division, charging patent infringement and unfair competition under state and federal law. Atari's lawsuit sought a preliminary and permanent injunction against the manufacture and sale of Coleco's expansion module and requesting $350 million in damages. Coleco said it would file a counterclaim charging violations of antitrust law by Atari. Coleco countered with a $500 million antitrust lawsuit that claimed Atari was trying to discourage retailers carrying Atari products from also carrying Coleco. They also charged that Atari created an unfair advantage in the industry when it bought part of Pac-Man inventor Namco, and that it violated antitrust laws as well. Atari's claims remained unproven and were dismissed, and both sets of charges were settled out of court by April 1983, when Coleco agreed to pay Atari royalties for sales of the expansion module. Right in the middle of legal proceedings, Coleco was busy designing a new system. This system would essentially be an expansion module 1 as a standalone console. By the time that the new system, called the Coleco Gemini, was revealed to the public at the CES show in February of 1983, it had been rolled into the agreement between the two, and Coleco would be paying royalties to Atari for every system sold beginning in March of 1983. Now with the settlement between Coleco and Atari hot off the presses, Coleco was ready to sell their Gemini. Coleco pushed the Gemini hard, with many retailers supporting it. Here it is sharing a center spread with the Atari VCS in the 1983 Sears catalog. The big selling points for buying a Gemini over the official VCS were threefold. First, it was cheaper. Although prices varied with different retailers, generally, the Gemini was $20 to $30 cheaper than the official console, which was a big sell for lower income families. Second was the unique controller design of the Gemini. These strange looking controllers combined the standard Atari joystick with an analog paddle in the same controller. It's a really cool design, though they do feel pretty cheap. Third was the Packin Titles. Atari offered various Packin bundles for the VCS. All Atari models came with the game Combat, but Atari additionally offered games like E.T., Pole Position, and Pac-Man at various points. The Gemini would be packaged with Coleco-published titles, most typically Donkey Kong, Carnival, Frontline, and Mousetrap. Our Gemini came with the Packin Titles Donkey Kong and Mousetrap, a combination that was exclusive to Sears stores. They both have a sticker on the back denoting them as Packin Titles, which is pretty neat. I said our Gemini came with them, but actually we have two Geminis? Multiple Geminum? Whatever. This one we bought console only. It's interesting though, as it's a Canadian model, meaning it has been relabeled to have both French and English text for its controls. Looking at the Gemini, you would think it would be an expansion module with a power cable, but no. Its design is pretty different externally. though it keeps the same layout for ports and switches. One interesting aside is that Coleco sold a version of the Gemini with Columbia House Records, the company famous for, or rather infamous for, selling music through mail-order record clubs, and generally being quite sketchy. Columbia House would sell the Columbia Home Arcade, a Gemini with all of the stickers replaced, mail order, with a bunch of Atari games, most of which were games with severe overstock from retailers. While exact numbers are hard to pin down, the Columbia House Arcade is an extremely rare console. It's theorized that less than 10,000 were created. The system would only be sold for a short amount of time, and the vast majority of systems went unsold. Those systems would first be offered to Columbia House employees, and after that, the rest of the stock was destroyed. One thing that really entertains me is comparing the sizes of all three devices. Here's our Atari 2600, which is by no means the bulkiest VCS model released, next to the rather small Gemini and the tiny expansion module. So what do you think? Did you own a Gemini back in the day? Was Coleco playing dirty with the release of the expansion module? Do you want to pick up a Columbia Home Arcade? So many questions. I hope you enjoyed this look at one of the most interesting stories of the early years of gaming. There's so much more video game history we would like to cover, so make sure you subscribe, and of course, let us know what story you'd like us to talk about next time.